Ok, tai sveiki visi, kurie yra Danijoje ir labas Saulė. Today we're gonna have a workshop about economic motions. So just a little bit about the background of economic theory and how to deal with economic motions, and I'm gonna give you some motion examples and overviews. So I'm going to tackle four main economic theories that I think could be useful for debates. And firstly, we're going to start with classical economics. So there's main three things that classical economics introduce. So firstly, they argue that there is a need for an absolutely free market. That means absolutely no government intervention, no taxes, no subsidies, no tariffs, nothing. And the classical economics say that the market will regulate itself. And it's going to do that through adjustments of supply and demand. So, for example, if demand rises, the price is going to rise as well, uh, leading to lower demand in the end. And it's just going to leading to higher supply and then regulating the market. And this is, according to classical economics, this is likely to create competition, which will produce the best quality of output and the most choice. And a few things, with the pros and cons things, I'm always going to try to introduce a few points that are going to be useful in debates. So something that you can take from this is that the pros are more competition. Pros of no government intervention are more competition, which means better quality of goods, because as companies compete with each other, they try to produce a better good than another company. So you would buy their product, and therefore a better choice because there's a wider range of choices. However, there are some negatives. So, for example, negative externalities. Let's say that a company pollutes a lot and they throw dye in the river while dyeing clothing. No one is there to control that, and people have to suffer, third parties have to suffer. Secondly, there's lack of social welfare, as there is no government intervention. The government is not able to, for example, give unemployment benefits to people. So a lot of individuals who are, for example, not able to work are going to be much worse off. And thirdly, we have market failure. So if the market is not able to regulate itself, which does tend to happen, we have a market failure, which can constitute in a couple of things. So it could be a monopoly that controls the entire market. It could be a collapse of an economy, which is very rare, but that can happen as well. But yes, that's market failure. The second type of economic theory is Keynesian economics. And Keynesian economics believes that the government should control and protect economic policy. And specifically, they believe that this should happen through fiscal policy. Fiscal policy means spending, government spending, and taxes. So that's two ways government controls the economy through fiscal policy. And the government does this by affecting the demand of goods and services. So, for example, if the government raises taxes, people have to spend a higher portion of their income on taxes instead of goods and services, and therefore they'll spend less on goods and services, reducing the demand. And according to Keynesian economics, this protects the economy from unemployment, recessions, and deflation. Again, something that points that could be used from this is that government intervention helps avoid recessions or makes them easier to go through, and it improves public structures because, as said, there's a lot of government spending, so that means better roads, better schools, subsidies for people, better benefits. However, there are a few cons as well. That means less private investments, which could mean, for example, less competition or less innovation at some points. There's government inefficiency, as we know governments take long bureaucratic processes to create these spendings. and therefore these spendings can become very inefficient or badly timed. And lastly, there's dependence on governments. So if the government starts doing this, they might create a healthy economy, but however, it's only going to be healthy as long as the government is helping it. Then, third type of economics, trickle-down economics, which were introduced by Ronald Reagan, therefore they are known as Reaganomics. This was a policy that he introduced, and that basically means tax benefits, tax breaks and benefits for corporations. And what this essentially is trying to do is make the wealthy wealthier and trickle down their wealth to everyone else. So the general idea of this is, for example, if you make a wealthy person very rich, they're gonna buy a Porsche, and the people who produce Porsches and who work on them are going to get more money. That is essentially the idea. So that those are the presumed pros, that there's jobs created, there's reduced inflation, and there's economic growth as the general GDP of a country grows. However, this does create very large growing income inequality. So it makes the rich richer, and realistically, it makes the poor poorer because it doesn't give any benefits to them, and it just creates a larger inequality, and it has questionable real life effects, as Reaganomics had a lot of issues when it was implemented in the US. And lastly, Marxist economics. So here's the general idea of the theory. Marx claimed that two major flaws in capitalism lead to exploitation: the chaotic nature of the free market and surplus labor. And he said that specializing of the labor force and a growing population was pushing wages down, and that the value on goods and services was not accurate. A lot of Marxist economics also rely on the idea of oppression by the bourgeoisie. So they're saying that the bourgeoisie controls the means of production, and they are forcing the working class to work there for very low wages and to pay higher prices for products than they should. Therefore, Marxist economics suggests that at a certain point in time, capitalism should collapse and the proletariat should take over the power with a dictatorship of the proletariat. That meaning not an actual dictatorship, but a ruling of the proletariat class. And we could look at some pros and cons of this as well that can and have been used in the debates. So it's firstly better lives for the working class, better social welfare policies. Of course, as the proletariat can introduce the social welfare policies that they need the most, and less useless work. As we know, a lot of jobs right now are just stuff like consultancy and marketing, which do not create realistic value for the society. However, some may argue for some cons. So there's less innovation, as there is less motivation to gain money from consumers. There is less innovation to create the most interesting, the most beautiful, technologically advanced product. Essentially, some argue that there's less motivation for people to work. So a lot of people in the status quo are motivated to work by money. And if money becomes not an important point, if money becomes kind of equal for everyone, some might not have the motivation to work and stand out. And also, there's obviously historical instances where some countries tried to apply this economic policy, and it came out into brutal regimes and strong oppression. So this was for a few of the a little bit of the economic theory. And then also I want to introduce some basic economic knowledge that could be useful just both in understanding debates and in debating economic motions. So firstly, very basic thing, a basic market graph. In a market graph, you will always have the price on the y-axis right here and the quantity on the x-axis right here. So that's a Q. You also have the supply graph and the demand graph. And these graphs are able to move around. So for example, if people really like an advertisement of the product and more people buy them, the demand shifts to the right, and then both the price and the quantity at which the item is sold increase. So this is a very basic market graph. Oh no. Okay. Then another concept that you definitely need to know is inflation and deflation. So inflation is a term that is mentioned a lot, both in debates and in the general world. And it is a general increase in prices, reducing the purchasing power of money. So usually when inflation happens, the wage stays the same or increases very little, and the price of the products increase by a lot more. So you can buy a lot less goods and services with the money you're getting. The deflation, on the other hand, is a general decrease in prices. Now, this may sound good because we all want cheaper products. However, when prices decrease, people also lose jobs because as there's lower prices, suppliers are less likely to produce goods because it's not as valuable for them. So therefore, a lot of companies may go bankrupt. They might fire their workers, and then those workers lose their jobs. The economy stagnates and falls, which leads to unemployment and other very big issues. So deflation, despite sounding good from the first glance, is definitely not a good thing. Then we should talk a little bit about ways to fix it. So there's two main ways that are used to fix inflation and deflation, and that's fiscal and monetary policies. So in debates, realistically, you would only talk about fiscal policies, but just so you know both types. Fiscal policies happen when government actions involving taxation and spending money influence the economy. So I was already talking about this one with the Keynesian theory. Monetary policies, on the other hand, is what happens when the central bank fiddles with interest rates and money supply. You don't really have to understand how this works. You just have to know that it's done by the central bank and that it's quite slow to take effect. So then we talk about economic growth a lot. And let's talk about how to measure economic growth. So we usually measure economic growth with GDP, which is a measure of a country's total economic output. So everything that everyone sells, exports, produces, all added up together. And usually, the higher the GDP, the stronger the economy. However, there are also other measures, for example, GDP per person. So a country might have a generally really high GDP, but their GDP per person can be really low. For example, the GDP per person in China is most likely smaller than the GDP per person in Norway, even though the total GDP is vice versa. And then we can look at economic growth in graphs. So this is a graph of the economic growth of the US, and we can see when the main dips happened. So for example, COVID-19 pandemic made a huge dip. Inflation due to the war in Ukraine also made a huge dip. But in total, economies tend to grow over time. So even though there's dips, there's total growth in the long term. And let's also talk about something that's been happening in the recent days. So we know that Trump has introduced reciprocal tariffs and just generally tariffs. And we have to understand what a tariff is first. So a tariff is a tax or a duty imposed by the government on imported or exported goods. So why are tariffs useful is to protect the local businesses. Because what you have to understand is that when a tariff is introduced, less imports are going to take place. And that is because importing a good now costs more to the person selling. So they're just more likely to avoid selling to your country. So it protects the local businesses which now have to take place of the importer. However, there are some issues. So firstly, there's obviously less choice because you cannot choose from products from another countries. And there's also what's been very much happening with the $16 eggs, inflation. Because a lot of the time, the cost of the tariff, the cost of the tax is placed on the consumer and not on the importer. So now, if the import tax on one egg is $1 instead of $3, it's going to cost $4. So obviously prices increase. And also because there's a scarcity of imported goods, prices increase further. So what has happened is Trump has introduced tariffs in the US, which has never been the case before. And while he's saying that everything's going to be totally fine and the economy should be better and thriving, at this very moment, uh, the stock market, the US stock market, has lost around $4 trillion. And you can just imagine how high $4 trillion is. And just today, the day I'm recording this, the US stock market lost $2 trillion. So that's a lot of money. And that's a lot of very unhappy investors. Yes. And also keep in mind that for companies to produce goods, they need to import raw goods usually. So for example, for Coca-Cola to produce Coke, they need to import sugar. And now that that import costs more, they're going to need to cover that price by raising the price of Coca-Cola. So yes, I put in a bit of a graph of the decline of the US market. You can see that all of the big seven companies are in a major decline. In the stock market, even 5% is already a big decline. So looking at these numbers of from 13 to, well, Tesla is a different story, but from 13 to 28, that is a massive decline. Okay, then, after all that theory, which wasn't that long, let's look at some example motions where we can use all of this theory. And this is probably going to be the most useful part, probably, because you get to practice, and there's also, while motions aren't usually just pure economic theory, you can just use it a little bit. So I placed the motions into a couple of types of motions that a couple of categories just so I could introduce more of them. So we have some basic economic motions, I would say. So for example, this house believes in cheap labor, or this house would support a mandatory retirement age. So these aren't very political, although they are legislative policies. These are, you would mostly argue here from like a socio-economic perspective. But yeah, they have strong economic backgrounds to them. So let's look at an example motion. Um, so this first motion is this house would nationalize all housing. Yeah. Um, yes. So does anyone in the room have any ideas what the arguments for the proposition of this motion could be? Anyone? I guess not. I'm just gonna keep talking then. Okay, so there's a couple ideas for proposition arguments. This is not a structured case, just a couple of ideas. So for example, nationalizing all housing can provide affordable and accessible housing for all individuals. So this could be particularly relevant when discussing examples such as Amsterdam, where I am located right now, or Toronto or LA, where people are struggling to find housing and especially affordable housing, where people are called house poor, meaning that their rent price is more than 30% of their income. And by nationalizing all housing, we could technically control all of that and just give everyone housing who needs it and give everyone housing at an affordable price so that it would not be normal to be paying 2,000 euros for a one-bedroom apartment. Secondly, it helps to increase the wealth gap. So the wealth gap partially arises because of the differences in assets, and it increases because of the differences in assets. Because if you don't have much money, you're most likely not going to buy assets such as stocks or real estate. So your income is always going to be used up for your spending, and you're never going to have a continuously growing net worth. If you have more money and you invest on top of getting your salary into buying an apartment and then renting it out, you will always get this passive extra income that you can then reinvest and you can continuously grow the amount of capital you have. So that's one of the things that nationalizing housing can help, as buying apartments and renting them out is a huge way to increase your wealth. And then lastly, it can improve the quality of life for individuals living in bad conditions. So as we know, landlords usually do not really care about the tenants. They care about the tenants' money. So that means painting over mold and just leaving there, or not taking care of the rats that are running around in the apartment. And the government would be forced to take care of these things as they nationalize the housing instead of monetarily driven landlords. However, on the opposition side, we can look at other arguments. So, as for example, nationalizing all housing would lead to a lack of incentive for property owners to maintain and improve their properties. So, um, this would mean that if, for example, you had a home, you owned a home before, and now and you used to renovate it every 5 years to keep it in a good condition. Now, when the government nationalizes it, it's not yours anymore. So you don't have the motivation to renovate your house every 5 years. Instead, you just don't do it, and um, yeah, instead of that, you just kind of either don't do it or do it super rarely and keep it at a minimum livable condition. Maybe, I guess, especially if you know you're about to move out. That means a worse condition of housing for people in the future. Moreover, this would require significant bureaucracy and resources. So this is a very economical argument. Meaning that basically, well, not only does it cost a lot of money, but the government is generally very inefficient. So there might be a big gap between when an issue arises and when it gets solved. Because if you have a landlord, and your washing machine breaks, you can call your landlord and they will come the next day to fix it. But with the government, if your washing machine breaks and it needs fixing, you would need to wait weeks until that information gets received, confirmed, addressed, and fixed. So it'd be much, much slower, which can bring in issues, especially in cases such as rodents or mold. And then lastly, it's a more philosophical argument that when you live in a space of your own, you can have a greater freedom of choice of where you live and how you live as well. So imagine if the government is nationalizing all housing and distributing it to people. There's a limited number of housing, of course, and currently that is limited by prices. So if the prices are too high, people are not likely to move to that city. However, here you would be very limited as if there is no housing, there's absolutely no way for you to get a house in that specific city where you want to go. So that was section 1. Section 2 would require wider knowledge of current events. And that would be, for example, a motion on the tariffs of Trump that I just explained. Or something like Bulgaria should abandon its plans to enter the Eurozone. Or South Korean government should break up at Cherbourg, which is a very large company that essentially very large companies such as Samsung that basically rule South Korea. So here this would usually either have an info slide or it would be a prepped motion, and you would have more time to read up on these important events. An example of this would be this house welcomes the advent of a China-led global economy. And a few reasons why. Or a bit maybe about the background. So recently, China has been investing, especially into Asian and African countries, for example, by building ports in them, building infrastructure surrounding the ports, giving general domestic investment for infrastructure, and placing their company facilities there to encourage investment as well. And a few good things that come out of that is obviously more infrastructure. So the mechanism here is quite simple. Um, More money, more infrastructure. You could say that as they build a port, they have to build a road to the port, and then people get a new road. Or they have to build water pumping facilities, and then people have clean drinking water. Moreover, this would kind of change the global economic system, which is currently very strongly US dominated. We can see that from the fact how the dollar is used as the general worldwide currency to understand prices, and how big of an impact the tariffs of the US have had on the world generally, for example. And a Chinese leadership, uh, economic leadership, would help to create a few poles in this economic world, where it wouldn't be um, as US centered. And that would lead to a couple of impacts. So it would generally reduce the power of the US. So they would have to be more careful with things such as tariffs. But also, it could give better tailored solutions to countries. So again, it's the marketplace of choices, and countries have more choices of who to choose, who to partner with. So they don't have to necessarily choose the US and, for example, sacrifice their belief system or the political system of the country in order to get aid from the US. They could keep their political system and be friends with China instead. And lastly, and this is generally just an argument about China, is that it would accelerate global technological advancement and digital infrastructure because China tends to invest very heavily into technology, such as electric cars, development of phones, development of um, CPU chips, and etc. However, of course, there are some issues with the China-led global economy. So as I just said, countries don't no longer have to change their political values, which on the one hand is good, because you should be free to believe what you believe. But that also means that democratic values generally get undermined. As you don't have to become democratic to get aid, which can be an issue if there is strong oppression in the country to follow the political leaders. And moreover, the current model of China has been known to use suppression of information and control of information, and this could spread to other countries if they gain very strong influence. Moreover, as I said, China is very likely to invest into technological development by a very large amount. However, that could create some very big issues around data security. So you may know that the EU has the GDPR. The US also has some weaker but still data protections on who can see your personal data and how can they process it, how can they use it. And therefore, you can avoid it being used against you. However, China does not have these restrictions or these laws. So there is definitely a risk of, for example, surveillance that's being used through your data, or your data being used against you, inferred data being used against you, which is definitely an issue. And then thirdly, a China-led economy would destabilize international labor standards and environmental protections, because once again, the domestic protections are much lower. Um, so if they control another country with through their aid, they're unlike a Western country, they wouldn't force the aided country to introduce better labor and environmental standards. Although this can definitely be refuted by just saying that Western countries, let's be honest, they don't do anything in the developing world. We have seen the factories collapse on people, um, and that has been by Western companies. So definitely refutations are possible for both sides. These are just basic arguments. Then we have a bit more political economic motions. So stuff about social mobility, um, some more political stuff of like, should surrogate motherhood be legalized? Should cocaine be legalized? Should child labor be legalized? So generally I'm going to look next into these motions of should X be legalized? Um, and specifically, we're going to look at the legalization of child labor. And I know this sounds horrible because who would want child labor to be legalized? That is absolutely crazy. But there is a possibility to argue for something like this, even more, even so. And the main arguments that you always do uh, when the motion reads something like some government should legalize X, and X is something that is horrible for society. And the main argument here is avoiding the black market. So your horror here is the black market because there the government is not able to regulate at all. There the government does not know what is going on. And there the worst things can happen. So, for example, in this case, legalization creates better protections for working children. That means they cannot work too many hours. They have to have an education. They have to have a certain wage level in order to be able to work in these companies legally. And that would protect the kids from working for 14 to 16 hours from getting $1 a day. Um, and in these emotions, your stance is that this horrible thing is going to happen either way, that there's no way to avoid this horrible thing. And therefore, we have to make the horrible thing as least bad as we can, by giving as many protections for the person as we can. So similar motions are protecting workers in prostitution, where you protect them from sexual assault, where you protect them from being abused, being trafficked. There are also motions about legalizing drugs. So, for example, recently there have been drug use rooms introduced in Canada, I'm pretty sure, where people can just come in and use drugs in the specified room, and they're given the drugs by the doctors. And that sounds maybe weird because why are you supporting addiction? But realistically, they have already saved around like hundreds of people from overdose because people often overdose from these drugs and they would die if they were alone and not in this facility. And in this facility, they also obviously are on the road to recovery, they're not forced, but they're strongly encouraged to go to rehab if they're willing to do so. So that's the general sense in these types of motions. But now, without going on a tangent, no more. So another idea would be that regulated child labor would also allow impoverished families to legally supplement their income while ensuring children can still access education. Of course, this is a very non-optimal option, as we would love that families made enough to survive and to feed their children. However, realistically, there is a certain percentage of families who are not able to do so, who need the help of their children to eat and survive, who need more people working in their family. And only by regulating can we assure that the children actually get education. Because otherwise, the children would just, the working child would just go to work for 16 hours and go to bed. But if there's strict government regulations, the child would be able to work for 4 hours maybe, and then, or maybe 8 hours, and then study for four, which would give them at least a certain level of education, leading them the way out of poverty. Because otherwise, they are stuck in the cycle of poverty, as they're working, as their parents work a low-paying job. Therefore, they have to help them. They don't get the education, and they themselves go off to a low-paying job. And then lastly, and this is a very economic argument as well, would be that this creates tax revenue and economic benefits. However, this is not enough of an impact in debates. We know we need to tackle the vulnerable agents, not tax revenues. So in order to make this argument valuable, you would have to say that this can be invested in child welfare programs. So that would mean maybe, what could that be? That could be introducing more schools in a small village or town, or introducing night school for working children, as horrendous as that sounds. Or maybe just investing into control of companies. So that would be the third argument. And then on the opposition side, you would usually in these motions argue that despite government regulation, and despite the government still trying to stop this bad thing to happen, this X to happen, the X is going to spread wild and still have the harmful impacts, and the mitigation of them by the government is not enough. We need this X to be gone completely. So, for example, in this case, we would say that legalizing child labor would perpetuate cycles of poverty. So instead of saying like, oh, they might have some time to work and educate themselves right now, we would say, let's look at this realistically. They are just going to work for 14 hours now, maybe paid a few dollars more, but they still don't get any education, which then, perpetuates the cycle of poverty and forces the children of these children to work in the future. It also increases the bargaining power of companies, sadly. So, because these children are more susceptible to exploitation, and generally because the labor force is larger, companies have a larger pool of people to choose from who do not care or do not understand the bad working conditions, which makes it very difficult for adult workers to negotiate, because even if they leave the job, there's going to be someone replacing them, so that like a child replacing them who does not care that they're breathing in toxic gases because they don't understand what toxic gases are. That essentially means that you're not able to, for example, threaten that you're going to leave, or threaten that you're going to tell your friends to leave as well, because you can all get replaced with someone who's more vulnerable and more convincible. And then lastly, again, a more economical argument for the last one, it would damage the reputation of Philippines, because, as I said, just the notion of legalizing child labor sounds very, very bad. So yeah, hearing that from other countries would not go around well. And if trade relationships are harmed, the Philippines are less likely to be able to export their goods. Therefore, they would be making less money. Therefore, they would be able to invest less into protection of workers, protection of children. So again, you can always take an economic argument and create a social impact about the vulnerable characters from that economic argument that makes it much stronger than just damaged trade relationship. That is not enough. And then last section. This has been a pretty quick workshop, not gonna lie. So these are just kind of miscellaneous ones I have found. They're just generally while looking for motions. So for example, this house regrets the rise of free-to-play models in video games, or the glorification of unpaid work, or others that you are able to read about anytime. So we're gonna talk about unpaid work now. For you to understand, unpaid work is stuff like volunteering or unpaid internships or taking care of a sick relative, being a stay-at-home mother, things like that. So from preposition, you could say that it perpetuates economic inequality and the exploitation of labor, because by glorifying it, you encourage companies to not pay their workers. And especially that happens in, again, unpaid internships or through volunteering, as in where companies say, yes, you may come in for an internship, but you will not get paid. Now, to impact this, it is not enough to say that people don't get paid, but you also have to say that this disproportionately disadvantages the vulnerable. Because if you don't have enough money to sustain yourself from your parents, for example, if you're a university student and you have to work to sustain yourself, you're not going to be able to do an unpaid internship and work at the same time, just because we have limited amount of times in our days, and internships are often full-time. So that means that you may only get an internship if your parents help you out or fully support you. And then this leads to the fact that only if your parents were rich will you be able to easily get a job through that internship. And if your parents were not able to give you money, you're more likely to just be stuck at a lower level job because you are not able to get that experience. Then the second argument is just a more psychological one here, that it devalues professional expertise. Um, because basically, if someone is willing to do your work for free, or similar work for free, your wage is also likely to go down because there is more competition for you. There is, again, more, as in the Philippines case, there's people who are willing to work for less. And if you quit, if you leave, there's someone who is cheaper will take over. Sorry, water break. So someone who's cheaper will take over, and generally that's going to reduce wages. And lastly, we have to talk about the disproportionate effect on women and gender inequality. So a lot of the time, stereotypically, it is women who perform unpaid care work. So that means if your grandparent is sick, it's most likely going to be your mom who's taking care of the grandparent, not your dad. And that, or women are much more likely to be stay-at-home moms than dads are likely to be stay-at-home dads. And the impact of this generally is that women get less opportunities because, again, you have a limited amount of time in your day, in your week. So if you spend 40 hours a week taking care of a grandparent, you won't have the time to advance in your career, to do extra work to advance in your career, or generally to even have a full-time job. And that impacts both financial independence, which is bad because then women are not able to leave toxic marriages, that affects self-actualization, as you're not able to get a fulfilling career. That also affects ability of just general employment in the future. And last content slide, opposition side on this, would be that celebrating unpaid work encourages the development of essential life skills that are usually overlooked in generally a monetary-driven society. Because in a monetarily driven society, the essential life skills that you need to know is how to do your job, how to earn as much money as you can, obviously how to like make yourself food, how to sustain yourself financially. However, some very, very important skills that we also need are things like empathy. We need to learn how to feel for another person. And a great way to learn how to feel empathy for another person or animals is to, for example, volunteer in an animal shelter or in a homeless shelter. Because then you learn to see people in other situations and you meet them and you see that these are people just like yourself, and it could be you in the situation. And again, impacting this, you could say that this would lead to a generally more empathetic society that is more likely to help each other, to support social welfare policies, to donate when needed. Then, secondly, it helps maintain vital social support systems. So, as you know, most NGOs, a lot of educational systems, a lot of shelters, they run on volunteer work. Even as we saw in the statement, the Lithuanian Debate Society runs on unpaid work because these are systems that are not able to make money, usually just they're not able to make money dot. And in that case, if we glorifying unpaid work encourages people to do that very necessary unpaid work and to run communities and communities and community centers and to run neighborhoods, to help neighborhoods thrive. And these jobs are very necessary for a healthy society because otherwise we would only have things that make us money. And let's be honest, we all want a small little book club to go to. But like that's not a very good impact. A very good impact would be there's no one to work at an animal shelter. So now all stray dogs run wild and they get sick and they have to die. Well, that sounded horrible. I'm sorry. And yeah, they have to pass away because of neglect. And then lastly, this helps. This is a very iffy argument, I would say, as it would say that it helps to acknowledge valuable contributions that are invisible on economic metrics. So on the one hand, this has to be argued very well, because you would have to say that, for example, being a stay-at-home mother is very valuable. Therefore, for you make stay-at-home mothers feel very, very well about their lives, their life choices. If you create self-actualization for them. However, you have to, mm, there is a very easy refutation to this that valuing does not matter if you're not able to make ends meet. So you really have to thread the line of really pushing the impact of the importance of self-actualization on a person, that sometimes a person would rather have less luxuries, because less luxuries or even less basic goods in order to self fulfill some sort of self need or self want in self actualization want in life, because those things are so crucial in the pyramid of needs. So these have been some emotional reviews, some theories, everything. I also put in some possible resources and possible news sites, some econ teachers that I've watched, um, where you can look up extra information for yourself. And obviously, always feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. So that's gonna be it.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions?
Um, I think not now when I'll be getting into the material more deeply. When debating, I will definitely have questions, but for now, no. Thank you.
Okay, so then feel free to text me. Wait a second, wait a second, wait a second. Yeah, feel free to text me on my Instagram. It's just my name and surname. Anyways,